So this is a video that I've wanted to make for some time now, however I'm not really sure who it is for, outside of myself and a handful of others. Growing up I always loved the art of film and wanted to make my own movies from a young age. As well as this, I've always loved horror, and thus the two have led my career path into the world of special effects makeup. But this obsession with film now has a knock-on effect when it comes to my watching movies, as now I don't simply watch the story being told, but also make observations on the structure of it all, and how it was all put together. This can often be a burden, particularly for those around me, as I dissect the movies I watch scene by scene. But alas, it's how I've always been, and it all started when I first discovered these Universal classics. Hi guys, welcome to, or welcome back to, Hydra Collectables, where we let our geek flag fly, and in this week's episode of the Hydra Review, we are taking a look back at those classic Universal monster movies. That's right, you heard me correct, we're going to look at them all, so strap yourself in and enjoy. So originally I thought about reviewing these classic movies one at a time, and who knows, maybe one day I will come back and do just that. But for now, I figured I would give my general overview on these movies, as I feel that going too in depth with some of them might bore the more casual fan. So what are the Universal horror movies? How many of them are there? And in which order should they be watched? Well, to answer these questions and more, I am going to break this video down into chapters. But before I continue, let me first make these honourable mentions. First, starting with Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera from 1925 and The Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923. I mean, while we're at it, let's also throw in Chaney's lost movie, London After Midnight, from 1927. These are all great characters and great movies, and could very well be included on this list if you prefer. The only reason why they are not in this video is purely because I feel that they are a different format. These were the original silent movies, whereas the ones that we're going to be exploring are the talkies. They came much later, and thus they are a slightly different type of film. However, if you wish to include them as part of the Universal Monsters team, that's absolutely fine by me. After all, in my opinion, they do still count. Chapter 1. Building a Foundation. In 1931 we were introduced to Dracula. Dracula was the first Universal horror movie to be released with sound and was a huge success, in large part due to the role's actor Bela Lugosi. And this is a name that comes up a lot in this video, so be sure to take note. Now, it's interesting to note here that this movie was actually based upon the Broadway play of Dracula and not the original novel by Bram Stoker. And this is important because Lugosi actually played the role of Dracula in that Broadway version before doing this movie with Universal. Though definitely dated when compared to modern movies, this now iconic classic still really holds up today, as you can see with the pioneering techniques they used to produce this film. Later that same year, Universal released their second monster movie titled Frankenstein, and once more it was a huge success. And again, this too was based off of the stage play and not the original novel, with the role of the monster going to actor Boris Karloff. Now originally Universal wanted to utilise the fame and star power of Lugosi. However, after he refused the role due to him wanting the role of Dr. Frankenstein and not the makeup-heavy monster, the role was instead given to Karloff, and Lugosi bowed out from production. It is also worth noting Boris Karloff's name, as he too appears consistently throughout this video. In the role of Dr. Frankenstein, we got an actor by the name of Colin Clive, and actor Dwight Fry returned after his role in Dracula as Renfield to play Frankenstein's assistant Fritz. So let's just pause right there for one moment. I've seen this film many times before, and yet for some reason, it might be some sort of Mandela effect thing, I always thought that Frankenstein's assistant was actually called Igor. If you thought this too, please hit that like button to show that I'm not alone. So throwing in my 2 cents, let me declare that Frankenstein as a movie is frickin' awesome. It is without doubt one of the best within the whole series of 20 plus movies. Yep, you heard me right, 20 plus movies. I mean, after a while I just had to stop counting. And I'm not alone with this thought process. Myself and many critics at the time and since have even stated that this film might be better than Dracula. This movie is visually stunning and keeps you hooked throughout, and that scene where Dr. Frankenstein screams aloud, "It's alive! It's alive!" has become a pop culture quote for the ages.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
So following these two highly successful movies, both released in the same year, Universal released another in 1932 titled The Mummy. And I'll be honest guys, this is one of the weakest for me. Don't get me wrong, it's still a great movie, but it's no Frankenstein or Dracula. The title character of the Mummy is portrayed by Boris Karloff, with Universal again wanting to capitalise on the stardom and fame of what came before. And to be fair to them, despite my thoughts on the movie, it still really worked, and was a box office hit. And so that brought us on to the fourth film within the ever-expanding universe, The Invisible Man, based on the novel by H.G. Wells. So if you look closely at the credits of these movies, you begin to see a pattern emerge. You begin to see the dollar signs beside the names that bring success to the box office. And so Universal, never missing a trick, decided that they wanted to put their two greatest back to work. The Invisible Man was directed by James Whale, whom had previously had success with Frankenstein, and had its title character played by, you guessed it, our good friend Boris Karloff. Only wait, no, that didn't happen. Universal couldn't get Karloff back to play the role, and so instead it went to Claude Rains, and he was magnificent. This story and film beautifully captures the madness of a man whom has gone insane after turning himself invisible. It's an intense and exciting movie, and one that sticks with you for days after watching. So before we move on to chapter 2, let's just pause for a moment and take a look at this lineup. In just 4 movies, Universal had both created and established 4 of the greatest movie monsters of all time, and it was far from over. Chapter 2, fleshing out the characters. So chapter 2 is where the sequels begin. Now granted, not all the movies are sequels, but we do start with one, in the movie titled The Bride of Frankenstein. The Bride of Frankenstein was, and still is, as true of a movie sequel as there could ever be. Whale returns to direct, Karloff returns as the monster, and Colin Clive returns as Frankenstein. It's just perfect. This movie takes place literally right after the first, continuing the story right where we left off, and deserves its title as one of the greatest sequels ever made. The sequel made double what the original movie made at the box office, and so Universal looked to making another. Universal turned their attention back over to Dracula, and created a sequel titled Dracula's Daughter. So as the name suggests, this story tells the tale of Dracula's daughter, who is now the one terrorising a local town. The only returning character and cast member here in this sequel is Dr. Van Helsing, played by the actor Edward Van Sloan. And he's a good enough character and portrayed really well, but I don't think it's enough to rank this movie any higher than average at best. And I say at best because this movie did not do well at the box office. In fact, it tanked. And with Universal getting bought out by new owners who didn't really care for the horror genre, this was the last Universal monster movie that we would get for 3 years. So what brought Universal Monsters back? What made those new owners change their mind? Well, it was all thanks to them re-releasing those 2 originals, Dracula and Frankenstein. Seeing these movies shown again in theatres gained Universal a ton of money, and so they decided to reignite their monster universe. And so in 1939, Son of Frankenstein was released in theatres. Now granted, Whale does not return to direct, but Boris Karloff does return once again as the monster. And that's not all. Bela Lugosi also returns, this time playing the role of Igor. And yes, I do actually mean Igor this time. Now, for most people, when you say the name Igor, they think of a small hunchback man, a ghoul as such. But that's not who this character is, not at all. No, this character is a criminal whom survived a hanging and thus has a broken neck. Now I admit this movie isn't as strong as the previous 2, but it's still a good movie and still made the studio a lot of money. The next sequel Universal released was the movie titled The Invisible Man Returns, but unfortunately none of the talent from the first had returned for this movie. However, we did have our first appearance by none other than horror legend Vincent Price. So, this movie, how can I put it best? So, this is by no means a bad movie, and it did actually make a lot of money, but it's not really a horror movie. I don't know, it's kind of just a drama. I guess you'd have to see it for yourself to really know what I mean. And so that brings us on to the final movie of this chapter, and this is a movie titled The Mummy's Hand. And yeah, it just doesn't work for me. So that's the sequels done. Universal had some wins and they had some losses, and now it was time to inject some new life into the series. Chapter 3, bringing it all together. Now granted, this first film within this chapter could technically be considered a sequel. It is after all The Invisible Woman. However, it is so different to what came before that I really don't think it counts. After all, this movie is a comedy. That's right, a straight up comedy. And it actually had a lot of success being so. Was this to be the end of the Universal horror franchise? Were we now only ever to get comedies? Well, fortunately no. Lucky for us, for reasons unknown, Universal went back to basics, back to their winning formula, and gave us The Wolfman. Universal brings back both Claude Rains from The Invisible Man and Bela Lugosi, with the Wolfman himself portrayed by Lon Chaney Jr., and he is perfect in this role. Honestly guys, this is a true return to form, and this re-established Universal as the definitive monster maker. And so, wanting to hone in on their success once more, Universal released another Frankenstein movie, this time titled The Ghost of Frankenstein, which starred Lon Chaney Jr. in the role of the monster and Bela Lugosi once again returning as Igor. The character of Dr. Frankenstein in this movie is actually the second son of the man that we see in the prior movies, and again, unfortunately, this movie just isn't as strong as those that came before. Again, it's not a bad movie, it's just not as good. So at this point, it really feels that Universal is back. They're back, right? Well, no. Universal released yet another non-horror themed Invisible Man movie titled Invisible Agent. And this is a spy action adventure movie, a far cry from the horror that we all want to see. After that, we got another mummy movie titled The Mummy's Tomb. But then they done the unthinkable. Out of nowhere, Universal gives us Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and boy was this fun. Lon Chaney Jr. is back as the Wolfman, and Bela Lugosi is back as, well, Frankenstein's monster. If you can believe it, it's all come full circle. The man that didn't want to wear that heavy makeup actually returns to portray the role in this film. And this is the first time that we can see and declare that all these films are in fact connected, that we have a cinematic universe. So that's chapter 3, and what are we, like 10 to 15 movies in, and we've only just established that this is a shared universe. What will they give us next? Chapter 4, the beginning of the end. Watching these as a kid via my VHS player from recordings that I had got from the telly, this absolutely blew my mind. The fact that we could have these monsters cross over within their own shared universe, and it wasn't to end there. So we begin the final chapter here with another sequel titled Son of Dracula, and I'm sure you can all guess who they brought back to play the title role. Nope, not Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney Jr. And this is actually pretty impressive, as one actor has now portrayed the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and now Dracula. Now, as you can imagine, this movie unfortunately doesn't really bring anything new to the table. It's your standard run-of-the-mill Dracula movie. So after this we got yet another Invisible Man movie, but thankfully this one returned to its horror roots. This movie, titled The Invisible Man's Revenge, starred John Hall in the title role. The movie goes back to its origins and has the title character going mad once more due to his ailment. This idea, this concept of the Invisible Man going crazy and having that more horror element to it really works, and it's great to see it back on form. So after the Invisible Man sequel came another from The Mummy, this one titled The Mummy's Ghost, and well, yeah, it is what it is, I guess. Anyway, this was followed up by House of Frankenstein, and this movie has it all. So before I continue, let me just pause right here, because there's something that I noticed rewatching these films again for this review that I never really considered back in the day. I always used to think that Dracula was kind of like the Iron Man of this cinematic universe. He was the glue holding it all together. But actually rewatching them now, it's more Frankenstein. In fact, it's more Frankenstein's monster. He seems to be the one that's holding all of this together. He is the reason for this shared universe. Within this movie, we see Boris Karloff return to play the mad scientist, Lon Chaney Jr. is back as the Wolfman, John Carradine, who once played the Invisible Man, is here as Count Dracula, and a new actor of the name of Glenn Strange plays the monster. So using a modern movie that we're all familiar with as a reference point, this movie was meant to be the monster version of the Avengers, and was meant to have all the different characters that we had seen throughout the franchise all appear within one movie together. And as awesome as it sounds on paper, I'm not really too sure, having seen it, that it actually worked out. Again, this is not a bad movie, but it's not really a great one either. Then after this, we had, you guessed it, another Mummy movie, and yeah. Look, okay, I'll be honest with you guys. The Mummy movies aren't awful, they're not bad. I really do like the character design. However, in the grand scheme of things, when you put all these movies together, The Mummy just isn't my favourite. And if I am going to ever watch a Mummy movie, then I'm going to go for those modern Brendan Fraser ones. Hashtag Brendan Fraser if you agree. So that brings us to The House of Dracula, a somewhat sequel to The House of Frankenstein, although it's never really all too clear on how these characters came back to life. And what can I say? This wasn't very good at all. In fact, for the most part, it was just boring. So was this to be the end? Was Universal over? Not even close. Like any long-lasting franchise that outstays its welcome, there is always more. However, they were not all duds. In fact, one stands out as my favourite of all time. I am of course talking The Creature of the Black Lagoon. The Creature is a Universal monster that was late to the party. In fact, I'm not even too sure he counts. But to me, he is superb, and is my favourite creature design ever put to screen. Now granted, the sequels aren't great, but the first movie is definitely worth a watch, and in my opinion, one of the best. So there you have it, a brief walkthrough through the Universal Monsters cinematic universe. Over the years we have seen each of these characters parodied to death, and so one wouldn't be blamed for thinking that these original movies might be a bit lame or silly, but they're not. They are actually proper films, and most are actually good. And you know what? If you take a closer look at these chapters, and if you change the name of them to phases, it is clear to see that the modern MCU utilised a similar template for its own creation. We had an introductory period in Phase 1, establishing characters and the world in which they lived. Phase 2 fleshed out these characters with sequels and expanding their world. Phase 3 brought them all together and revealed a shared existence, and Phase 4 saw everything fall apart. Thanks for watching.